Good evening. I am Ming Fung, Director of the Graduate Programs here at SCI-Arc, and I would like to welcome all of you to tonight's lecture. I would like to start it with a quote from landscape architect Mark Tribe, who said in his book on modern landscape architecture, A Critical Review, quote, "It has been said that ideas in architecture follows about 15 years after those in art, while those in landscape architecture are 15 years further behind. A simple reason for this time lag might be based on biophysical force. Plants takes a long time to grow. But this explanation is incomplete. Designing a landscape is informed by technical and design issues as well as cultural values. Unlike building, there are few, if any, really ugly trees or shrubs or flowers. Thus, to plant 4 trees of any sort in any arrangement will be perceived by most people as a positive environmental contribution. The primary amenity level is so great that the question of what could be achieved at the higher plateau is rarely posed. It is the quality of the second plateau that distinguishes landscape architecture from mere planting, and it is only there that new ideas are usually developed," unquote. So I think that it's got to be very frustrating for our guest, Pete Walker, to be told from the outset that he is 30 years out of date before he's even out at the starting gate. Fortunately, Pete Walker has never listened to those prognostications. Craig Hodges and we met Pete as when Helmut Jahn's Sony Plaza at Potsdamer Platz was taking place. Pete Walker expertly intervened in the vast central space, turning what might have been a cavernous, awesome yet uninhabitable space into something at once casual and engaging. The strategies that he employed were art strategies, far from the banal world of adornment, and deeply into a structural modality that looked at the space as an architect might look at brick and mortar, which would be then replaced by resin and sap. Like a jazz singer who uses a voice as an instrument, Pete Walker uses the language of paving, drainage, and vegetable matter as accurately and as incisively as we all use white flanges and tempered glass. And he has been one of the few landscape architects to carry on the tenet of modern landscape design, which was first voiced by Garrett Agbo, who designed most of the case study houses, and then Kylie, who with a few other lifted landscape architecture, lifted what we call landscape architecture from a nice occupation to one which commands attention for its artistry and ingenuity. Pete Walker graduated from the Harvard School of Design in 1957 after receiving his bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley. He has been chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at UC Berkeley in the late 90s. He held the Charles Elliott Chair at Harvard in 1992. That was also one of the chairs which was held by Charles Eames as well, and also has been acting director at the Harvard University of Urban Design program at GSD. His teaching career has paralleled his professional career with guest lectureship at Penn State, UC Davis, University of Illinois, to name a few, and innumerable speaking engagements throughout the world. And most importantly, at the International Federation of Landscape Architects World Congress in 2005, where he was awarded the first ever International Landscape Architecture Award for lifetime achievement. So you can see that it was more than simple fate that the collaboration between Pete Walker and architect Michael Arad went on to win the commission for the World Trade Center Memorial. Their work is a blend of art, architecture, and landscape architecture, in which traditional hierarchies are abandoned in favor of a new holistic framework in which the total immersive experience of the participant is the only arbiter. Now, without further ado, I invite Pete Walker to immerse you all in the experience of his work.
Ming, thank you very much for that thoughtful and overly flattering introduction. I do want to talk about the memorial tonight, but because I work for a very big agency, which used to be the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation and is now as the foundation where Mayor Bloomberg is the chairman of the board, and almost anything you say in public is reported back, and they watch facts very, very dearly. They're not easygoing in New York, and because this project has gone on so long, as I will show you, I thought that it might be interesting for some of you who may know very little about landscape architecture and certainly would know nothing much about what we do. I would go back and give you a little sort of autobiographical story of how we got to the point of doing the memorial. So let me start. This is, can you see that one? This is Foothill College. It was the first job that we had when we opened our San Francisco office. Sasaki, who was a young professor at Harvard at that time, and I were required by Ernest Kump, who was the architect for Foothills, to come out and open an office, because our office at that time was near Harvard in Watertown, Massachusetts, and open an office to take it through working drawings. And so a friend of mine named Tony Gazzardo and I came out and opened the office in order to do this project. Next, please. It was an amazing time in California. We were engrossed in this new junior college, but there was an explosion of educational work, the educational master plan for the state, new universities, new junior colleges, new high schools. I mean, there was a huge expansion going on about 1960. Urban renewal was going. This one on the left-hand side is Alcoa Plaza in San Francisco with Chuck Bassett at Skidmore, and also with Chuck Bassett at Skidmore, the corporations were going out into the countryside and doing these great palazzos for their headquarters. This is Weyerhaeuser on the right. Next, please. Next, please. In Southern California, there was not so much institutional work, but there was a tremendous amount of housing. And we got in at the sort of beginning of what we like to call the Newtown movement, where large pieces of land are organized and then different plots are put in them, different kinds of housing and so forth. And I had done my thesis at Harvard on the new towns of Europe, so for me it was tremendously exciting. I have to say I wasn't very interested in houses, but I was tremendously interested in housing. And so if somebody would bring us 40 houses, then that was worth fooling with. So on the left, these are both with Fisher Friedman. The left is the first project of multifamily housing at Irvine, and it was put across the river from the Irvine proper, because they were afraid that the single-family market would start thinking that Irvine was radical and brash. After they sort of found a market, the one on the right is called Promontory Point. And what was starting to happen, as you can see in these two slides, was that what was sort of a Sea Ranch knockoff was starting to become more pictorial, a little more sweet, and it just seemed to me that we were going in the wrong direction. Now, we had hundreds of these projects. Our office by then had gotten up to be a couple of hundred people. So this was a huge development. And all of you, the younger ones, you've just seen the residue of that, which is all over Southern California, all over the United States for that matter. But at that time, I started wondering whether this was where we were going. I had started off as a modernist, or at least at the tail end of the modern movement, and this just didn't seem to be, the sort of pictorialism didn't seem to me to be where I wanted to go. Next, please. At the time, I was collecting art. We'd made a little money, and I spent it all on art and on chasing art. Most people, when they start collecting, they read everything they can get their hands on. They read the books. More importantly, they read the catalogs. They go to galleries. They go to New York. They go to Marfa. They go everywhere. And I was essentially educating myself. I'd had a lot of art history, but it really hadn't anything to do with the great period in the 60s, the minimalist period. And I was really excited about Smithson, and I was really excited about Don Judd, and I was interested in what they were doing in the landscape. Although it was a little painful, because it was so much more interesting than what we were doing. These little houses with, tile roofs and little windy paths and stuff. It just seemed, like two complete worlds. Of course, it was two complete worlds. And even because these things are out in the landscape, they were where I was working, but they were clearly working on a different plane and in a different way. Next, please. My favorite was Carl Andre. I just completely fell in love with his work. And I would go to LA to see Carl Andre. I'd go to New York to see him. I'd go to Chicago. Wherever he had a show, I would go because I just thought it was terrific. And in my excitement about collecting and my excitement about learning, it started to get to me that these guys were talking about landscape in some sort of essential way. I remember seeing my first Frank Stella painting, which this isn't one of them, but remember the story goes that he did this painting and then he came to the corners. This pattern was sort of all over the painting, and then he came to these places and he didn't know what to do, and he asked a friend, what should I do? And the friend said, well, why don't you cut them out? And again, that was a sort of strategy for making a surface and decorating a surface, but it was coming off as something much more powerful. And I still find them beautiful and interesting today. I mean, they're not something that was novel and then went away. Next, please. It was very much, to me, interesting in the way that Mies van der Rohe was interesting. When I first went to Illinois and saw my first Mies building, and we went to Aurora and we went to 860 and we went all around, and I just was knocked out. I mean, they were so beautiful and they were so spare. And for some reason, these minimalist sculptures were like that, had that same quality. And our landscapes weren't like that, did not have that quality. Richard Long, would go on these hikes. I don't know whether you know who he is, but he goes on these hikes and he walks out and he walks geometric patterns until he wears them into the ground. Could be a circle or a line or a triangle. And he essentially makes a landscape with his feet. And then he brings the material, on the left-hand side, he brings the material back into a gallery or a museum and lays them out in this way. And I always looked at them in landscape terms, but they were totemic. They had some internal interest, mystery or something that moved me. And it again was a terrible contrast to the work I was doing, because I didn't find any mysticism in what we were doing. I found a lot of commercialism, but I didn't find anything like this. I remember walking into this gallery in Portland, and Carl Andre had taken a bunch of concrete blocks and brought in a whole series of little pebbles and laid the blocks out, as you can see, and then laid a pebble of different size. The blocks are all the same size, and then laid a pebble of different size on top of each block. And I remember walking in that door and suddenly seeing nothing on the walls. In a way, there was no architecture here. It was all landscape, and it was all laid out on the floor. But I couldn't connect how one would take concrete blocks or pebbles or whatever and make landscapes out of them. I mean, it was starting to, I could start seeing the relationship, but I couldn't figure out what to do. Next, please. Here's another Andre, which is just railroad ties across a meadow, and in this kind of gestural thing. And if you came through this meadow, if you walked through it, or if you drove through it, or if you rode a horse through it, however you came on this meadow, it looks like almost any meadow that you could find. You know, it looks a lot like meadow. But with this gesture across it, I've never forgotten it. I can't imagine how you would ever, you know, turn that into an abstraction that would just go under meadow. It went under something else, went under art, went under something more important. Then Christo came to California. This is about the time that I was sort of ending up at SWA. This is in the 70s. Christo came to Northern California, and across Sonoma and Marin counties, he built this running fence. Now, this was a landscape that I'd known as a kid. I'd grown up there. I would hike over to Stinson Beach along the Dipsy Trail. I mean, I really knew this landscape, but I had never seen it like this. It was so exciting to me. And I remember we went out and walked it. I had a friend with a four-wheel drive. We drove this damn thing. I even had a friend that we got in a small airplane and we flew over it, because then you could see it, you know, go all the way to the sea. It was really exciting. But again, if you had asked me then, how do you make a landscape out of silk sheets, I would just say there's no real relationship. But it was a landscape so much risen, so much more important visually than the landscape that I'd moved across. And it wasn't romantic at that level. It wasn't Olmstedian. It wasn't looking like the landscape. It was looking like something else. And to me, it was sort of electric. Next, please. So I kicked myself upstairs. I became chairman of the board, and I had an offer. I'd had an offer for some time to go back and teach at Harvard. A friend of mine, Chuck Harris, Sasaki, had retired and had actually moved to California. And Chuck Harris said, come on back, and I'd like you to teach. So I said, well, okay, I need a sabbatical. I've been at it 20 years, and I needed something different anyway. So I went back and I started teaching, and I'm sure those professors who are here know that teaching is really much more important for the teacher than it is for the students in terms of their own work and the way they think. They're able to ask abstract questions, and they're able to get people to work on those, and they're able to get insights and go through their own thinking, and you have time, which you don't have in an office. You have time to sort of sort things out and put things together. So a friend of mine, Bill Johnson, who was dean at Michigan in landscape, and I took a group of Michigan and Harvard students to Europe. And we toured around. We got off in tour originally, and then we went up the Loire Valley and went to the various chateaux, and then did a tour around Paris, the great chateau around Paris. And I remember sitting there and looking out over Vaux and thinking, Burnet's figured this out. He's figured out how to make a garden like the André sculptures. He's figured out how to put those things down, how to tauten that surface, and how to make them infinitely more important than they are, visually important than they are. And so, next please, we came back to Boston, and Martha Schwartz and I and John Wong made a little garden on top of our house in a row house, Georgian row house in Back Bay, Boston. And we didn't have, you know, great lawns, and we didn't have parterres, but we did have bassins. We brought up little mirrors up and put them out. And it was interesting because they started off as really kind of rip-offs of Carl Andre. But the minute these things got outside, there were forces working on them, and things were changing around them that made them, at least to me, much more interesting than just the materials themselves or even the strategy of pattern. For instance, the sun would go across, and then the shadows would go across, and when the shadows went across this one, they still glowed blue. They were still reflecting the sky, even though the shadow was crossing them. And it's like light bulbs, this is an amazing thing. And I'd never seen this in the galleries. This was the kind of thing that you had to kind of discover. And we did a whole series of things on this garden. We changed it. At the end of the day, these windows would light up. People would come at dusk, and the windows would go up, so we changed the mirrors to have the same shape as the windows across the way. So we had this kind of recall, and we're reaching out and pulling in images from outside and recombining them, essentially, and making a garden. Next, please. Kathy Holbridge, who's a dear friend of mine who was at that time was running the gallery at MIT and has just left the Walker, as maybe some of you know, and is now at MoMA, can take over a large section of MoMA, the painting section at MoMA. And she was having trouble because she'd put a Michael Heizer sculpture in here and the trucks had really torn this area up. This is the great lawn in front of the dome at MIT. And it was May Day, and she was afraid that people would, you know, she was running an art program around the school, in the grounds, and she wanted something to take the heat off. So she said, is there something you can do out in that great lawn, temporary, that will, you know, sort of take people's mind off this Heizer until we can get the grounds fixed. So we made this garden, Martha Schwartz and I made this garden, and I don't know, do you know what neckos are? They're these little candies that are in different colors. They come in a, you know, kind of a long paper tube, and they're, you know, they're pastel shapes, and they have chocolate and licorice, but mostly they're pastel shapes, pinks and yellows and blues and so forth. And they put powdered sugar all over them so they don't stick, so they have a kind of sherbety quality. Right across the street from MIT is the New England Confectionery Company, NECO. And so Martha and I went over and said, look, we've got this idea about the garden. Will you give us 10 boxes of NECOs? So he did. And we came back, and very early one morning, we laid out these two grids. And the small grid is made of these candies. And my students at Harvard really installed this thing, and we told them to eat all the chocolate ones and eat all the licorice ones because they didn't read, and just leave the sherbet ones. And then Martha's sister and her boyfriend found some tires around, old discarded tires around Cambridge, and then we spray painted them the same color as the NECOs, and that made the grid that turned off the other way. The students went bananas. We were cause celeb. They hated it. You know, they had articles in the MIT student paper. They talked about how they were starving in Africa and we were wasting, I mean, all kinds of things. And we sat down after this, have taken a tremendous amount of abuse, and we said, you know, we really have something here. Next, please. So Moshe Safdie had seen our roof. He had to climb up a ladder to get in there, and he and I were colleagues at that time. He had then come and taken over the urban design program, and I'd gone to the back to the landscape program. But he said he had this garage, which was a patent garage, and that means it's sort of off the shelf, and it can't carry any loads. It's got 150 pounds, you know, that's all it can take. And they had designed a garden for the top of it made of dirt and trees and all this kind of stuff, and it was tremendously expensive. In those days, $40 a foot. And weighed too much. They didn't think that the garage could take it. And they had troubles with drainage and all kinds of things. And he said, can you make a garden for the top of this which doesn't require all this paraphernalia? And of course that was just what we wanted to hear. So we said, okay, we'll try, but you have to realize that it won't look like a garden to most people. And when we go to the redevelopment agency, this was in the redevelopment area behind MIT, when you go to the redevelopment agency, you got to come in there and help me fight for this thing because they'll mow me down. It's going to be a real tough thing. So he did, and we built this thing. And we built these sort of trees, sort of like solid structures. And they were complicated enough so they change shape as you go around them, the way trees do. And we laid out a whole series of hedges, only they weren't hedges, they're little boxes that weigh 100 pounds. You know, if it's a 1 foot high and 1 foot wide, so they weigh 100 pounds and it can take it. And they're just wooden boxes. It's just like going into a nursery. And so we made this sort of Frank Stella thing here, and then we did some things with concrete pavements here, and we covered the whole thing with we found a kind of purpley gravel. And the drainage system, which was in the garage, was below this gravel, and so the water went through the gravel. We didn't have to have any catch basins or anything. The water went through the gravel and went down the drain and so forth, and it cost $11 a foot on top of the roof. So he was delighted, and surprising to me, the redevelopment agency in Cambridge was delighted too. So we were able to build this. Next, please. Here are, and I always wanted this thing because as these grow, You know the Stella black paintings, they were made with not very good paint, and when they first were there, they were crisp white lines and black in between, and then as the paint bled out, the lines became softer and softer, the white lines became softer and softer. Now if you look at those paintings, they're almost black on black. They're really beautiful. And my fantasy is that this will grow out and you'll gradually get a smaller and smaller line between them. And that was the way we were thinking. Almost take it off the wall and put it on the ground. That was our strategy. Next, please. Then we won a competition in Fort Worth for a woman named Ann Soul, and she was, I guess, the second richest woman in Texas, which is very rich indeed. And her grandfather had built this park, and it was not this park, but the park that was before it. And the interesting thing about it is all the structural parts were falling apart. All the stonework, concrete, everything was falling apart. But the trees were just starting to really do well. It was planted originally in the late 20s. And so our scheme was to leave the trees pretty much where they were and do this double grid and sort of slip it over the trees. And this park had been used traditionally when the president came to town, or when important people came to town, they would give speeches standing right here and then the park. And so we made a park which was about half solid and half green. But we took the green and dropped it down 6 inches so that we made this thing, as you move around, it's a little like an Escher. Sometimes you see it as hard and sometimes you see it as green. And then of course the trees come up through it. And the water is also dropped another 6 inches, and it is all mirrored. So it sits below this other grid, and this is all happening in 1 foot. So this is simply working with something and trying to get something out of 1 foot of elevation, but something very, very rich as you moved around. Next, please. As I say, some places you stand and it really looks quite hard, and some places you stand and it looks quite green. And that was the idea, to have something which played both ways, and doesn't matter which is which, just played that way. And then we were told Fort Worth has terrible weather. It can change 40 degrees in an hour, in an afternoon. And it also has really fierce winds that come through. And we were told that if we had jets out there, that they would be turned off about 200 days a year, because the wind is simply, if they're hydraulic jets, they're simply not going to be able to be on. So we made stainless steel wands and ran the water up the wands so that they're a little like birthday candles, and they play at the top of these things and then fall down and they sort of stick to the wands. And then we ran fiber optics up through there, the first time we'd ever used fiber optics, so that at night these things are lit, so that they have this strange thing, and you can walk through it. They aren't on the edge, you're not on the edge of a pool and looking over, you actually walk through the square. The pool is a great rectangle and you walk in and out of it. Next, please. Jumping ahead a few years now, 3 or 4 years. We'd been doing a lot of work for IBM, and they were clearly our largest client. I was no longer with SWA, but Martha and I started a firm, and then Martha went off to form her own firm, and so it was then now Peter Walker and Partners. And one of the guy named Art Hedge, who was the vice president in charge of development for IBM at that time, called me up and said, we've got this project in Japan. A kind of regional center for IBM, and it's going to be in a place called Makahari, which is about halfway between the airport and downtown. It's a new development, mostly commercial, some housing, but mostly offices and so forth. And I said, that sounds great. Who's the architect? And he said, well, it's Yoshio Taniguchi. And I had met Yoshio when he worked on a project in San Francisco years ago, when he'd just gotten out of school, but I hadn't seen him in 20 years. And so we went over there and became tremendous friends, and I've done a lot of work with Yoshio. And what Yoshio said is that what he wants to do with the building is he's going to make the building into a screen. Now in Japan, you don't have a podium like this if you want to elevate somebody, you have a screen. You get married in front of a screen, you get your attaboys in front of a screen, you get your degrees in front of a screen. And your tokonoma, of course, the blade of grass or the one flower and so forth, that's always in front of a screen. So he said, I want this whole building to be the screen for a garden in front of it, and I want the garden to be an art garden. And then he said something that really worried me. He said, I want it to be a Japanese garden. And I said, Yoshio, come on, I don't know anything about Japanese gardens. I mean, I know what they look like, but I'm not part of that tradition. And you still have people in Japan, Zen masters, who are still making those gardens. If you want a Japanese garden, he said, no, that's not what I want. I want a modern Japanese garden. So what we did is we took all of the Japanese garden materials, moss, stone, willows, all the materials, bamboo, all the materials you find in a Japanese garden, and we organized them. I'm sure the professors know this, but in the old days, you used to put information into a computer by having these punch cards. You'd punch in all the information, and then you'd stick them in the computer, and that was you didn't put it in like a typewriter, you put it in this punch system. And I remember when I first came to Harvard, everybody was upstairs on that upper level, and they had all the punch machines, and the kids were up there punching. Very early days of computers. So we organized all of this traditional Japanese material like a punch card. And the punch cards always had a datum. It was either orange or green that ran across the center. And so we had a datum which ran all the way through and tied all these pieces together. And people came on the train and then walked at the second level and saw these gardens as they moved into the building. And then when they were in the building, Yoshio had a whole series of slit windows, so that from the inside you could only see a small part of the garden, and the outside you get a chance to see the whole garden. So you've got the whole picture, like the orientation on the outside, and you've got little pieces of it on the inside. So we thought this could be an interesting play. Next, please. And here's what it looks like. You can see what it looks like when you walk in. Now this is actually on top of a garage, so it's dead level, and everything has to happen below that. And our datum line, which is a light pipe, is exactly at the surface of the water, of the grass, of the gravel, and so forth. So it's absolutely flat to all those pieces. Now, I just want to make a point. You're architects, and so you take technology and you take precision for granted because you have great contractors in you. Not in the United States, but if you're in Switzerland, you're in good places. You have great contractors, and they build things perfectly. You can get things built perfectly in Japan. You can get buildings built perfectly, better than the designs, most of my architect friends say. But they didn't build landscapes that way. And so we did a whole set of working drawings, and we started thinking in this sort of precise way. And all of that thinking was to get this thing dead level. And that's basically what I learned from Lenote, was that to make that surface and to animate that surface, not with things sticking up and so forth, but keeping that flatness. In other words, making the tabula rasa. And that, I think, was what I was seeing in the Andre things. That is a kind of metaphor for the landscape. For architecture, you often have a kind of vertical, sometimes a movement or a gesture. But in landscape, if you look at landscape paintings, if you look at a painting, for instance, let's say, you know, one of Ellsworth Kelly's paintings, and it has a blue top and a green bottom and has a straight line running down the through, you'd say, well, that's a landscape. And the critics would always say, oh, it's a landscape. And it is that quality of landscape that we really got interested in. It is the quality of flatness. And we were maniacs. We would do anything to make that thing flatter and flatter and flatter, to the point where it was kind of in your face. Our flatness had to show. It had to have enough power to show. And that was really the horse we were riding. Next, please. Next, please. Here's our datum line at night. The head of IBM said, look, you've got to have a stone. All Japanese gardens have a stone. And I didn't want to do it. I was into flatness. I wasn't into stones. And I tried to get Yoshio to go to him, and he did. And he came back and he said, you better figure out something to do with a stone. So we did a Magri stone. This stone is 7 meters high and 3 meters wide, and it's an inch above the ground. It floats above the ground. So unlike a Japanese stone, which generally has 2/3 underground and 1/3 above, this stone floats just above. And if you're sitting down in the cafeteria, you can actually see this space go through. Next, please. This is also IBM. This is a project, the first really large project. Up until then, our office was about, 8 or 9 people. which was fine. It was a kind of studio. And Art Hedge again came to me and said, you know, we're going to do this project in between Dallas and Fort Worth, near the airport, and it's going to be a huge development, 7 million square feet. And it's going to have all these buildings, and we're going to have a whole bunch of architects, Mitchell Jurgala, Ricardo Legarreta, I mean, a whole bunch of really interesting architects. And he said, I want you to come and be the landscape architect. And I said, fine, that would be great. As we got into this project, for political reasons, he was going to try and take the master planning away from the lead architect, and he didn't want to hire another architect for political reasons. So he called me up and said, I want you to take over the master planning. I said, we have a little tiny office. We can't do that. I mean, we're pretty good at what we do, but we just don't have any administration. We use the architects for administration. We just can't do it. And Art said, I'll get you anything you need, but it's important to us for political reasons for you to do this. So the next year we were 15, the next year we were 29, and now we're 40. And it really happened in about 2 years, and this was the project that did it. And this was a chance to do a great flat garden. It's in Texas. It's a farmer's field. There were a few existing trees out in the field that just hadn't died. The cattle hadn't killed them. And as you see in Texas, if you fly over Texas, the rivers in Texas don't go like that. They go like this because they're finding the low point and wiggle across this flat plain. So we tried to make things of this. The stream goes across, the pool is flat, and then laid over that was this sort of French grid. And these are all of Jurgala's buildings. And this is the garden in front. And there are a series of gardens going back. To give you an idea, this is about as long as the cross-axis at Versailles. That's about 800 feet long, that canal that goes out. So we're talking now about really huge scale. And trying again to use sort of minimal means and making the flatness the issue. This is the way we approached it. Next, please. And this is one of those canals that comes out. We made the levels absolutely flat, and then we took up grade and then made it absolutely flat again. And we tried to carry the water and have the water, which obviously has to be flat, have it be the guide for all the land. So there's no water separate from the land. It's like a mirror that sits right on the land surface. Next, please. Next, please. This is one of Ricardo Legarreta's buildings. This was the IBM Sales Center. I show this because it's sort of an introduction to the idea of plants. One of the things about plants is that they change. They change with the sun, you know, the shadows change, but they also change their nature through the year. And I started thinking about ways you could get people to see that change. I mean, it's like raising your kids. It's miraculous, but it has a cycle. It's like thinking about your kids and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. And every year, these things have this cycle. And then through the years, they keep changing the other way. And so I thought, you know, that is really wonderful. How could you abstract yourself to the point where you actually get people to start seeing that? And that became a whole new line of inquiry laid on top of the idea of flatness. Next, please. Yoshio called us up one day and said, I'm going to do this museum in Toyota City. That's the sort of Detroit of Japan. And it's a modern art museum. The mayor is collecting art, and there's one wing which is a famous ceramicist artist who was from that city. And then there'll be outdoor sculpture areas of various kinds. And there's a little castle, just a tiny little castle. I don't think anybody bothered to attack it. It was so small. And then there was and it was about 350 years old, and there was a little tea house which was over 300 years old. And look at the size, the scale of these, and the scale of the museum. And Yoshio was very concerned about that. So we talked about it a lot, and we agreed that what we would do is we would reforest the whole site. It was kind of scraggly when we started. We would reforest the whole site in a kind of circle. Toyota City looks a little like Oakland, or maybe downtown East LA, you know, where you're looking out over all these factories. It's just really boring. And because the castle is there, it's up on a hill. Japanese castles are always built on a hill for added protection. They use it, you know, to stop you from taking them. So what we decided to do was build this thing all the way around, have the paths go through the woods so that you would always look out at the city in a frame view through planting, and then a frame view the other way, and put water in the center so that you could never get to a place where you could see that against that or that against that. Next, please. I got interested in this 300-year business, and I'd met the great stonemason, Noguchi's great stonemason at Takamatsu, and went out. I'd been out there to see the foundation. It's a great place. If you can go there, it's really wonderful to see. We had some stone that was of the era of the tea house. That's the stone. And the guy came over and he said, you know, I know where that stone comes from. And I said, well, you know, that's not going to be acceptable to Yoshio, because Yoshio works in these very, very sheer planes. You know, it's all about having these planes play either parallel to each other or perpendicular, but always in this very sheer. He shows you the edges of everything. Shows you the edge of glass, shows you the edge of a wall, shows you the edge of everything. So I said, this is never going to work. So he said, well, what if we start adjacent to this little tea house, and we work our way down that stairs right there, and as these stones go across, they become flatter and flatter and flatter until they're absolutely sheer when it enters the building. And I said, God, can you do that? And he said, yeah, I can do that. So that was what we did. That was the stone thing, which moves you from this period, I guess, and then all the way to Yoshio, and this is the entrance into the museum right here. Next, please. There are several sculpture gardens. There's a big one for large pieces like Serra's and Big Lewitz. There are smaller ones for Pomodoros and Moore and so forth, which are more human scale. And we'd gotten to the point where we were getting pretty good with the surface business. We can change scale with the surface, not just the size of grids and so forth, but actually the roughness of grids and the kinds of materials. So you can take a place, this is about the same size as this, but it looks completely different, receives the sculpture in quite different ways. Next, please. And here it is. You know, you go out, wade around in this bamboo and the dwarf bamboo and have the sculpture pieces. And then these are all Don redwood, so they, you know, they turn orange in the fall. They're absolutely knockout. Next, please. Again, we had a problem with the mayor. He wanted something, and he wanted a fountain. And I said to Yoshio, I don't think we should have a fountain. We're putting sculpture out here, and almost any fountain you do that's kinetic, you pump the water up or something, it's going to compete unfairly with Serra's and with the smaller, particularly the smaller pieces. So he said, no, I think we're going to have to do this. So we developed this fountain which is made out of air, and it's pumped up from the bottom of the pond, and it just breaks the surface, and it has no vertical dimension. But it has a very powerful surface, and you can light underneath it. It's like a scrim. You can backlight it, and it also changes as the light changes. Next, please. And that circle takes on slightly different, it's a different scale, it's a different color, but it's trying to do something which has no mass and make it an important thing in the landscape. Next, please. Ming mentioned Helmut Jan. Done a lot of work with Helmut. And Helmut's great for us because he's crazy, and in very much the same way that we're crazy. Tremendously intense, you know, works at what he works, and you know, and he and I appreciate the kind of attitude about this intensity. So this is the Sony Center, and it's basically, this is about 300 feet from there to there, and it's some 6-story buildings with a couple of towers at either end. Apartments, offices, commercial buildings, and at the base it's a series of restaurants and so forth. It's really a city square, and on top of it is a big tent that's across this thing. It doesn't actually, it's not air conditioned, it still has air in there, but it changes about 6 or 7 degrees, which extends the falls and helps you in the summer. So it extends that season. Of course, Europeans will go out and sit in tables and chairs in their overcoats because they like to be outside and they like to be in a cafe. So it's just making that easier. The other thing that we did was that this is for Sony, and they had this multiplex movie that's downstairs. And they wanted to have a great staircase in the middle of the plaza, and they wanted a huge sign that showed all the movies, you know, like they all are. And so Helmut and I got together and we said, well, what if we just cut a hole in the middle of this thing? And what if we cut it in a way that you're inclined to look down, that sort of directs you, and you're looking down and you're looking into the lobby of the theater. So you see people walking around down in there like a hole in the earth, and something's like ants down below. So that's what we did. We cut this hole. Next, please. The pavements, Ming was saying, these pavements are grids which collect all the water. And these are those beautiful little black cobbles that you really only find them in Berlin. They're absolutely gorgeous. They're really small cobbles, and you find them in sidewalks all over the Ku'damm and around in the center of Berlin. And then we put lights which were set in the old material and not set in the new material. And we have electricity running through this so they can have boat shows and car shows and stuff. We have our drainage in there, and we have our trees growing out of that because we have dirt in there. So there's a system, this, you know, about 4 foot of stuff that's doing all these jobs and producing this pattern. And we make a lot of little models in fairly large scale to see how they're going to look and to see how the scale is and see how the benches are and see how the lights are, things that are big enough you can put people in them. So and again, architects do this all the time, but landscape architects basically work with maps. They don't think in those terms generally. But we were working at this level of precision which we had to think in those terms or it would just fall apart. Next, please. And here's the real material. These are these little tiny cobbles. This is the metal grating. All of these are working with the grids of the buildings. Helmut always works with complex grids, and these are all picking that up using the metal which catches the light. This thing eats into the light. These are the lights coming out of the cobbles, essentially of a very rich vocabulary, but all perfectly flat. Next, please. Here it is in the daytime, and here it is at night. And I always worry about plazas. I never worry about it when you have 10,000 people in them. You don't have to worry about a plaza then. I worry about it when there's just a few people, when it could look lonely. And you have to have something that just holds it together through those times when a few people are coming by. Next, please. And here's the hole. It's a series of hedges which drop down, and a pool which has a glass bottom which cantilevers out over the hole itself, and you can look down into the lobby and you can look up through the glass all the way up to the tent above. Next, please. Here's looking down, and here's looking. This is in the lobby of the theater looking up. And if you ever go to the theater there and you do look up, you remember where the theaters are. You don't have to have a big sign. And of course, all around it they have these cafes. And this has become one of the few modern places, public places in Berlin that is popular, really popular. Next, please. We then won a competition in Japan because we'd been doing a lot of work there with a friend of mine named Yoshio Takamatsu, who was a colleague been at Harvard for a while and was back in Japan practicing. And this was going to be the center of a new urban center. And they decided to build the plaza first and then build the city around it. So the competition was for this plaza that would become the core of the city. And they were going to have a train station off one side, and they were going to have across these bridges, they were going to have a big arena, they were going to do all sorts of things. And it was in an old train yard. Just, you'd get up in a little building and you'd look out and be nothing but train tracks. But if you looked a little bit further, there was this line of Zelkova, this old street of Zelkova, sort of falling apart there and leading to something which looked like a woods. And I said to Yoji, I said, what is that? How did that happen to be? Because this is all, looks just like LA. It doesn't have any particular character, just runs on. And he said, that's a shrine. So I said, well, let's go see what that road is like, and let's go down to the shrine. Next, please. And here was the shrine, and it was in a woods. that had actually somehow gone through the war. It made it through the war. And so our idea was to, metaphorically, was to take a piece of that woods. Are we going to run out of battery power? Okay, take a piece of that woods, and just take it and put it in the center. Next, please. Next, please. So, very much like Berlin, we laid this thing out as a huge tree grate and made all the drainage in there and made it dead flat. I think this is the only plaza in the whole world that has no grading. It's dead level. Next, please. And this is the way it is. That's the flat top. There's dirt below. The water, the rain comes down, goes through the grid and comes into here, catches the trees, waters the trees, and then the drainage is all down at this lower level. And there's a shopping center below this. Next, please. And it's about 2 meters, and so there's a kind of spandrel that goes around here, and that spandrel is dirt. So it's a glass building with this sort of ant farm going around at this level, essentially telling you where these trees are growing. And Yoji found better than 400 beautiful matched Zelkovas. They now call it Zelkova Plaza. It used to be called Saitama. And so we planted them absolutely regularly across this whole grid. And it's spare enough so that you see the seasons. It doesn't have anything that's getting in the way of being able to see the seasons. Next, please. And here it is. This is this drain that's running across everything. Next, please. Goes in the winter, goes in the summer. Next, please. You can see the differences, the changing of color as you move through from one to the other. It's the same place, but it's a completely different place. So it's all about those trees living up in this kind of weird way in the air, but living really well and going through their cycles almost like a tokonoma, separated from everything else. Next, please. There's a place in the center, as I mentioned, there's a shopping center down below, and this lets light down into the shopping center, and then at night, the light from the shopping center comes up and makes this big plaza. And the plaza is used, for dances and so forth in the summer, and they flood it in the winter, they ice skate on it, and it's the kind of center of this court plaza. Next, please. And you can see going through the seasons. All of this has been built around it. None of this existed when we built the little plaza. This is the arena. Next, please. Now this is Nasher. We're talking a little bit about how you make things flat. It's one thing to make paving flat, but it's another thing to make grass flat. And so what we've done here is to take this whole layer and dig out 7 feet and then put dirt, which has been very heavily treated, has little pieces of plastic in it, has sand in it, it's mostly sand, and essentially make something which drains perfectly. So you can have an absolutely flat lawn, and then you can put sculpture on it, and there are no catch basins, there's no drainage, everything simply moves through that surface, organically moving down. And of course it's the most perfect soil to put trees in that you can imagine. Next, please. And this is a section showing what the scale that we essentially wanted, and what we were trying to do is make something that was both flat and still. Nasher has this great collection of 6,000 pieces, big ones, little ones, and everything. You can only put about 25 out here at a time. So they'll change this every 6 or 7 months. It's like that wonderful sculpture garden in Denmark. So you have only, a show and a half a year. But then they have to get in and out. So that soil and the grass that's on it, you have to be able to run trucks on it and then not have to repair it. So it's that tough. And it, as I say, it works with the drainage. Next, please. So you had to build a garden backwards. You started at the bottom here with some major electrical lines and drainage lines, and then you bring the trees in and you set the trees down on the bottom of the landscape. Next, please. And then you start building the soil up around the trees, starting to get up pretty near the surface here. And at that time, as soon as you have surface, you can bring in the big sculptures, the De Suvero's and Serras and so forth. Next, please. Then you roll out the grass, just because it's special grass, again, that can go under trees and in the sun. And you roll that out just like you'd put a carpet in an office. Next, please. And the last thing you do is you put the stone down, you put the pavements down. So the whole thing is built backwards in the way that most gardens are built. And of course, this is the result. Next, please. And this is what it looks like. Next, please. Goes through the seasons, pretty interesting. It snows in Dallas, if you can imagine. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Which brings me to the memorial. If you live in California, you were pretty far away from 9/11. If you have friends, or if some of you are from New York, it's quite different if you were there, particularly if you were within 20 or 30 blocks. I mean, it's just, nobody can get it out of their system. It just simply is so powerful. And when it started, this was the condition of the site. This was right after they cleared it. And this is the condition today. It's starting to come up. It's not quite to the surface of the street level yet, but the train station is in. The beginnings of the beginnings of the Freedom Tower here. There are the beginnings of the mezzanine. This is where the hub will be, Calatrava's train station. All of this is down 70 feet in the ground. It's all these levels. Museums, train stations, everything you can imagine, shopping centers, they're all down underneath. Next, please. So when I got a call from this guy, Michael Arad, and I'd seen the 8 semifinalists, but they were all young architects, and I didn't know anyone. Some were from Europe, and I didn't know who Michael Arad was. And he said, I'm going into this final thing, and they tell me I have to have a landscape architect. This was his site plan, this was his plaza. And he said, it's too bare, they don't like it, I need a landscape architect, we need to do something here. So I said, not knowing him, I said, well, look, let me call you tomorrow. I'm really busy. So I got on the website and looked to see which scheme it was. And it turned out that Michael's scheme was probably the only scheme that would really be interesting to us, or that we could really work on with success. And his idea originally was to be out in the Hudson River and somehow contrive a way where this river flowed into itself like a glory hole, but 2 squares like the towers. And his idea is reflecting absence, and it has to do with something that isn't there anymore. And I could see what the problem was here, but I could also see what he was up to, what his game was. And it was a terrifically interesting strategy to me. Next, please. Because I knew the references. I knew about Michael Heizer. I knew this thing, it's sort of the counter to what we do. We do flat things, and then Michael digs holes in them, and that was the sort of idea. But I also knew how Lenote had handled this. Is Chantilly. And I know how Lenote had handled this tremendously flat surfaces and then dropping into the water. So I was completely familiar with the kind of aesthetic or sort of central idea of this thing. And I called him back and said, yeah, we would love to work on it. Next, please. Originally, you were to go underneath. There were these 2 squares and then waterfalls running around, and then the names would be below them. And you would look through the waterfalls out into the voids, and you would go down these ramps. And that was our basic, partie. And what we had added to it was a series of rows of trees which were irregularly placed, but in straight lines running east and west, and irregularly placed running north and south. So if you entered the plaza this way, you would see a woods. You wouldn't see any order to the trees at all. It would just be irregularity, like looking into a dense woods. But if you turn 90 degrees and look the other way, you'd have a sort of Gothic arch running all the way down. So it would move in and out of being architecture, which was the basic idea. And this is what we presented to them. And complicated presentation and so forth, but this is what we presented to them on a Sunday at Gracie Manor. And then The next Tuesday, they called us up and said, you know, gave us some, you know, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. But then they said, will you sign a letter to those things? So they sent us out a letter, we signed it, we sent it back, and then they called us and said we had won. My life changed. It was a completely different world. You know, we were on TV, we were on the, you know, the morning show, we were, you know, everybody was after us. I mean, the governor wanted to use it to run, you know, run for office with. I mean, you know, we were just in the whole schmear of all of this political, financial, bureaucratic hell. And with Calatrava beneath us, with the train station beneath us, with the museum beneath us, I mean, there was just no place to look. We had somebody wanting something coming up. It's like the shark, you know, the shark's coming up at us, they're hitting us from the sides, people want stuff on the other side. And Michael's about 30, and now he's about 34, but I am so glad I got this job at the end of my career. I don't know how I would have gotten through this thing. I'm not sure we're going to get through this thing, but I don't know how we could have gotten through this kind of complicated thing if I hadn't had a lot of years, a lot of politics, a lot of clients, and a lot of budgets to work with. So it's been a fascinating thing. Next, please. And these were drawings made over a weekend to show what this idea was like. And we didn't really have it very much together, but that's what we showed the world. And we had our big press conference and so forth, and this is what the world saw as the winner. Next, please. So the first thing we did is, because we hadn't actually measured any of this, this was still very gaseous, it was a partie. And so we had to go back and see whether these things actually work. Could you make trees look one way and different the other way? Could you make trees that were in the scale of this whole without destroying it, destroying the whole? Could you make a plane beneath the trees that was flat enough so that you could actually get a Heizer? I mean, Heizers generally, they cut them I mean, either out of earth if they're huge, or out of concrete. If you've been to Beacon Dia, where they have 3 or 4 of them in a row, they're coming out of a polished concrete floor that's absolutely flat, and then these things drop away. So that was the thing we had to achieve. The mayor and many others there didn't want a big, you know, bare plaza. He wanted a park because open space is so dear in southern Manhattan. And he, you know, tens of, maybe millions of people in these buildings all around, and they've got to have someplace to go and, you know, go outside and walk around, have a smoke, eat their lunch, you know. And so he wanted this memorial to work both ways. And of course that was our job, was to, Michael's job was to make this thing holy, and our job was to make it popular. So we had to sort of bring that, and you can imagine the conflicts, conceptual conflicts between his team and our team, even though we were working together on it, because we were actually trying to satisfy 2 different sets of criteria with the same basic armature. Next, please. So we made a big model. We made an 8-scale model, one that you could see beneath the trees, one where you could see steps, where you could see the whole, to try and get a, you know, the size of this space. And I'd never worked with buildings. I mean, the Freedom Tower is so big you can't even see the top of it. And Foster's Tower is almost as tall, and then it goes down Rogers and then Maki. And we're working on all of that now. So I just, you know, I always worked in California mostly, and I'd never been in a place that had buildings that big, you know. And would a tree count? Does, you know, what is it, how's it going to work? What's the scale going to be like? And this model, we've changed it 100 times, but it's still in our office, big model, about as big as this area up here. And then every time something happens, we change it and look at it very carefully, photograph it. Next, please. It turned out that the tree thing worked pretty well. This is a view from the south, and this is a view east-west. And that really did work. But we had to be very, very pure about where we put those trees, and we had to have a lot of control. Next, please. We also had to have trees, and we went through from Europe. It had to be American, and not only had to be American, it had to come out of the 3 states, you know, that most of the people around, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, so forth. And we learned that New York didn't have any trees. There were no trees available. And we needed 500 of them. And we needed them perfectly matched, and we needed them grown on and boxed and so forth. So we went out and we finally did find these trees all over and collected them and then put them in boxes. And they're out in New Jersey now waiting to go in. Next, please. And then we had to say, well, how big are these trees going to be? Are they going to be like this? Is this going to be powerful enough? Here's a situation which is, these are white swamp oaks. Here's a situation which has finally achieved what we want, this kind of Gothic, tall Gothic space. And so how do you get started with that? And then how do you keep them going? And we ended up buying trees about 3 times this size in order to get this started, because if you trim these up as high as they need to be trimmed, there'd be no leaves on them at all. So you had to have larger trees. Next, please. And then again, this thing about going through the seasons. Here it is in spring, just rainy and the little buds are coming out. Here it is in the summer where the top is really heavy and the shadow down below is very, very solid. Next, please. Here it is in the fall. And then in the winter, it opens up again and you have a tracery of shadow, but you then can look up and, if you noticed in the other, you can't see the buildings, but in the winter you can look up and see the buildings. And around this, there's a large space. Every year, people come together and they read the names. All the family members come and they read the names. And maybe 10,000 people come to that. And this is going to take 5 to 10 million people a year, visitors a year. So we needed this big space. And we are planting liquid ambers all the way around that space. It's a space the size of a football field. And we're planting liquid ambers all the way around it. And liquid ambers in early September, if the weather is just right, on September 11th, turn crimson. So all the other trees will be golden, and then this ring around this center will be crimson. Next, please. Here's the big space. I don't know, the colors are coming out, but this is the space during most of the year, and this is the space when they read the names. It'll be absolutely packed. This is the Freedom Tower. Next, please. And then we looked at how we would do the things at night, and we were lighting them from low so you get the underside of the canopies glowing. Not lights up in the trees, but lights coming from below and lighting the lower side of those trees so that there's a kind of spiritual quality. One of the problems here is that people want to use it as a park. And though you can't walk your dog and you can't throw a Frisbee, you can use it for almost any other park. You can light out in the lawn, you can do whatever you want, you can have lunch. But they're going to keep it's almost like when you go into a cathedral in Europe. You can do almost anything you want in there, but you can't play baseball in there. And that's the sort of thing. And you're trying to get the park to tell you about this quiet, to tell you about the sacredness of it, without having it full of signs saying, keep off the grass, don't sit down, all of that kind of stuff. And so that's where we are now. Next, please. We have working drawings at 95%, and we're now starting over because there have been some changes at the Port Authority. Everything, we have about 10 agencies to deal with, and you deal with them every single week. You have a meeting with every one of them every week. And that's the way this thing is going. And so, as I say, they got the working drawings up, then they got bids, we're in the midst of value engineering, and now all the changes are coming. Because none of the agencies told or knew how to tell us what we needed to know until we did something and they found out that it didn't work, and then they told you. So we're now starting essentially to major revision of the working drawings. I'm sure listening to me you think this is a job from hell, and there are aspects of it that are like that. But still, it's one of the few things in our time where we've had an opportunity to do something. I mean, the Vietnam Memorial comes to mind. There have been very few opportunities to do something at this level, and at this level of precision, and at this level of hopefully, this level of art. And again, even though I wasn't in New York the day of the attack, many of the people that we're working with are in there. And every year, September 11th, they play the tapes, and you see them. You see them on television all day long. You see them in lobbies of hotels. They're just playing a loop on this thing. The planes keep hitting, they keep going up, they keep collapsing, and so forth. And when I think about all the bureaucracies and the difficulties we've been having on this thing, and then I think about what we're trying to, and nobody's going to care about the bureaucracies when this thing is finished, and I think about the thing we're trying to express. And you have to realize it's a tremendous honor. So that's the memorial. Thank you very much.